This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. We begin this week's programming with our cattle market update from Iowa State University livestock economist Lee Schulz. Lee shares insight on the sideways trade that we have seen lately and breaks down the Feedlot Marketing Data from the latest Cattle on Feed report. Also ahead, you may know Brandi Buzzard from her active presence online sharing information about beef cattle. She's become well known as a trusted source of information regarding beef from pasture to plate. And she joins us today to share insight on understanding your audience when sharing agricultural information online. We end with this week's wildlife segment where K-State aquatics and fisheries specialist Joe Gerken shares information on walk-in fishing access areas in Kansas. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are kicking off this Monday's programming with this week's cattle market update. And joining us for that is Iowa State livestock economist Lee Schulz. So, Lee, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So let's start off our cattle market update, as we always do, with our futures and cash markets. Were there anything crazy in either of those areas this past week?
Well, I think when you look at collectively, maybe not, and you see the fed cattle, live cattle futures contract, we were up slightly for the week, but when you really dig in there, we've seen a lot of sideways trade. And as I read these markets, I think the market is really looking for something to react to. And so we're likely to kind of be in store for a bit of sideways trade. Some may say we're in a bit of correctionary mode as we kind of move into, the next contract here, April being the near-term contract. I think when you look at the feeder cattle market, certainly it reacted to lower corn prices last week. So corn futures were down anywhere from about 5 cents to 10 cents. That certainly, I think, is flowing over to feeder cattle contracts, which were up anywhere from $2 to $3 per hundredweight. When I look at, the cash market in particular, we're still seeing the market react to relatively large slaughter supplies, but that's changing. If I look at this last week, we were down about 4 or 5% compared to a year ago levels. And so I think those slaughter levels are going to start tightening up, and we should see some further support in the cash trade.
You mentioned maybe reaction to the corn markets declining a bit this past week. And I feel like that's kind of the common thing I continue to hear is depending on how this year goes, we might end up with better crops and therefore maybe our grain markets will react to that in a way that might be not beneficial for our cattle markets. So do you anticipate that kind of being a trend that continues?
Yeah, when I look at, cost of gains are historically large, right? And so, we're really operating in a, new normal as we look at cost of gains. And what I like to remind people is we're seeing historically large average cost of gains, but really the marginal cost of gain is even greater. So when you look at that last pound of gain, that's really expensive from a feedlot standpoint. Now you have to pair that against, we're still looking at really high feeder costs too. So you're saying, well, I'm putting in really high feeder costs. I'm going to maximize the weight on those feeders. But it's really important to keep in mind that next pound of gain is expensive. And so, that's why I think we've seen weight certainly moderate a little bit, and that'll have an impact on cost of production. But yeah, you're right. I mean, when we look at this corn market, there's a story for a lot of different levels of production as well as prices. And so, right now, I think we're looking at really replay of last year as it looks at cost of gain for feedlots, but that could certainly change.
Sure. And you kind of mentioned that we're in this, you didn't say lull, but maybe this catch-up period of the market right now. And what does that really mean in terms of numbers? You said we might stay sideways, but at what point do you think that turns for us?
Yeah, I think we're on the beginning of it, right? So we're starting the ramp up to really stronger box beef prices. It's the ramp up to summer grilling, right? I look at it as baseball season. And so we've seen very strong box beef prices for this time of year. It seems like if we see one primal maybe take a step back, something else starts leading, right? So the rib and loin has been particularly strong. And I think all of that's an indication that, we're likely to see pretty strong box beef prices that will be supportive of the cattle complex, at least here as we look at the springtime.
Yeah, some near-term things to look out for. Great insight there, Lee. And I know we discussed this a little bit last week, the recent cattle on feed report that was released in February, but you really wanted to focus on feedlot marketings. So these numbers, let's talk through them and pinpoint exactly what that means.
Yeah, so when we look at the February cattle on feed report, and this is, again, is a USDA report, it's one of the last tables in the report. They include the number of feedlots, the inventory, and the marketings by size of feedlots. So you can kind of think of this as more of the census numbers, right? It's a survey that they send out, but it gives us these metrics to really look at changes in the size of the feedlots and the number of feedlots, and they break it down by size categories. I think a couple numbers to take away from the latest report. They indicated there was 26,093 feedlots in the U.S. in 2022. This was about 1,000 fewer than 2021, maybe a little more than 1,000 fewer than 2021. So we've seen a reduction in the number of feedlots. The smallest feedlots, so that's less than 1,000 head capacity, we've seen 1,000 less of those feedlots. I always warn people to take that number with a grain of salt, right? Because those are farmer feeders. So those feedlots are going to be, in production, out of production. It depends on when we survey and ask them if they got cattle on feed. That can change from year to year. But, I think it does pair a little bit with what we've seen in the less than 1,000 head feedlots. Iowa, we survey that data. And those cattle on feed numbers have been lower. Those placement numbers have been lower. I think as we started the show, really high cost of gains and rather strong corn prices, you're probably less likely to walk that corn off the farm through the cattle, right? You can just market corn. I think that really pairs well with, what we've seen with maybe a few less 1,000 less capacity feedlots as we look at last year. And then as you look at relative to different sizes where they all go up to over 50,000 head or over feedlot capacity. The larger have gotten a bit larger. So that largest size, they added 2 feedlots from 78 to 80 feedlots last year, whereas the smaller ones maybe got a little bit smaller. Importantly, I like to look at the percentage of marketings as each size feedlot represents. The largest feedlots, the 50,000 head and over feedlot capacity, they represent 35% of the marketings. On the small end, those less than 1,000 head feedlots, they're 13% of the marketings. And so that kind of just gives you a share of what is represented by those individual sizes.
There's a percentage there that's quite a large amount, that medium, size of feedlots. Was there anything really there that showed a lot of movement of increases or decreases in terms of what they're seeing?
No, and there was some small increases, decreases, but just as I mentioned with the smaller ones, I think a lot of those, it's relative to the number of cattle we have, right? So as we're in this contractionary mode and we're going to see tighter numbers of cattle, that'll impact the percent of marketings or the number of marketings that I have. So you may see some changes between those smaller or medium-sized feedlots, as you mentioned. One other piece that USDA provides in that report is the feedlot capacity in greater than 1,000 head feedlots. That was the same as it was a year ago. And that number can kind of be used as the relative change in just total capacity. We haven't really lost pen space as we talk about feedlots. Maybe we've just seen some of that pen space, those larger feedlots get a little bit larger, or those medium-sized feedlots get a little bit larger. And so we still have that overall capacity for feeding in the U.S.
Sure. And another aspect of the cattle on feed report you really wanted to talk about were some of the numbers where they give us information on heifers and steers specifically. So some interesting data there. Let's talk through some of those points.
Yeah, sure. So this is part of the quarterly estimates where USDA provides the number of heifers on feed, the number of steers on feed, and then you can compare that to the total number of steers and heifers on feed. And why that number is important, or that percentage, is because that helps us give an indication of where heifers are going. And so that's another indication of possible heifer retention or possibly sending those heifers to market, right? And so it follows the similar trend that we've seen, where we've seen more heifers on feed. And that's helped really support feedlot inventories and beef production in the short term, right? Because those heifers, we're not retaining them to turn into cows. They're going to go to feedlot and beef production. And so, that number is the largest. It was 39.8% of the cattle on feed were heifers. That's the largest since the 2000s. We have data back to 1996. So it's almost historically large for the percentage of heifers on feed. So what that tells me is I think we're continuing to see the story of this contraction of the breeding herd that was obviously indicated with the cattle inventory report as of January 1. Nothing certainly changed as we get into this first quarter of 2023. And so I think it is, again, much of the same as it looks at, tighter numbers of cattle going forward, maybe shorter term. We've mitigated that a little bit with more heifers on feed.
Absolutely. Yeah, a lot of pressure on those that are making, selection decisions. And obviously we're seeing that play out right now. And like you said, the number of heifers that have actually gone to market, and it's becoming more and more competitive for what animals are kept and which ones are sent off, like you mentioned. So that'll be interesting to see how it plays out, because that really is, like you said, a framework for showing where we end up in the future in the next 4 or 5 years is what's going on right now.
Yep. But I think, I mentioned earlier, I think when we visited, maybe that the replacement heifer and bred cow prices are maybe a little bit undervalued. Well, that would match that as, I think more are available on the market here short term. And so that's made more available. Now, we could argue if those are, replacements or they're going into feedlots, but that's only going to last short term, right? We're going to see some really tight supplies. And, I think these bred heifer prices are going to really escalate quickly. And so that goes to your, decision is those are really going to be dictated by the availability, but also the genetic potential, a lot of those females. And I think that's why we'll see some of those prices really escalate, and also a really wide range on those prices.
Absolutely, Lee. Well, thanks so much for the insight you've provided, as always. Thanks so much for joining us, Lee.
All right, thanks for having me, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was Iowa State University livestock economist Lee Schulz joining us for our cattle market update. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by Brandi Buzzard. She is a K-State alum and now is a very active person on social media when it comes to agriculture communications. So she's joining us today to continue our conversations that we've had the last several weeks on social media and agriculture and kind of the use of those platforms. So Brandi, before we get into things, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Samantha. I'm really happy to be here.
Absolutely. So like I mentioned, you're a K-State alum, but your roots to K-State go even further beyond that.
I think. I lived in Kansas except for a year when I lived in Australia. I lived in Kansas my whole life. I was a K-State football fan when I was a little kid growing up. I'm the first person on the Buzzard side of the family to get a bachelor's degree. And so that's really cool for me. And K-State was pretty strong in the running for that. And so I got my undergraduate degree here in 2009. I have dual majors in animal science and ag economics. I had to think about that for a second. I haven't used that econ degree in several years. And then I stayed on and got my master's in animal science as well. My husband was working on his PhD when we got back from Australia. And then I worked for K-State Research and Extension and the Beef Cattle Institute for about a year. So yeah, it's safe to say there's a lot of purple there.
Awesome. So I kind of wanted to start with how you got involved in social media to begin with. It's been a growing landscape for a while now, and you were really a forefront for Kansas specifically when it comes to people actively talking about the industry with maybe those that are considered outsiders to the industry.
Yeah, so I got my Facebook account when you had to have a university email address to get it. So when I first got Facebook, it was just sharing pictures of what you did on Friday night and status updates of Brandi is, and then thinking about spring break or something, and so that's what Facebook was when I got it. And that was in 2006. And then, now many years later, 17 years later, it's very different now. Facebook is a tool that businesses use for promotion, for growing a brand. And there's still obviously a lot of sharing what you do in your personal life and your families and staying updated with people, but it's definitely used very differently now than it was when I started, when I got on the platform. And Instagram was not even around when I started with a Facebook account. It had not been developed yet.
Sure. Yeah. That platform's evolved even to include educational components, which I kind of guess that's where you fall in. It's a lot of lifestyle, but also that education is also tied in quite a bit.
Yeah, so on my Facebook page that's focused on ranch life, that's my main goal is if there is a person who wants to learn more about their food and pretty specifically more about like ranching or where beef comes from, that's what my page is there to hopefully provide, is to provide confidence in our food supply that farmers and ranchers are doing the right things and the best things possible to get beef safely from the pasture to the plate. So yes, there's an educational component, but I don't want to force any of that upon people. I don't like to preach at people. I have done it in the past, and that is not a successful venture. I can sit here as someone who is not a perfect person and say that. And so, I hope to be a resource for people that they can trust. I put a lot of time and effort into building trust with people who are looking for information about their food, but also retaining that trust by being transparent, showing our lives on the ranch. So not just like little snippets of what's perfect, but what we call the real, showing the reality behind farming and ranching. Like we had to have a cow have a C-section the other day. That is not generally something you would put on Facebook or talk about because it's not pretty and no one wants to admit that they might have a calving issue. But that's the stuff that people need to see, that we were able to have a medical intervention to save this cow and her calf. And that's the kind of stuff that builds trust with grocery shoppers, consumers, and retains that trust because they know that we're being forthright with them and upfront.
Kind of building that trust, the aspects that go behind that, the thinking behind it. Knowing your audience, I feel like, is the first step. And you very well, by this point, have kind of defined what your audience is that you speak to on a daily basis. So what does that really mean for you?
My audience is anybody, I say anybody, but I'm really trying to reach that middle-aged or late 20s to maybe mid-40s group of people who are parents and have kids in the home. So they're trying to balance busy work lives, balance raising a family, balance budget, and also, feed their families healthy food. And so, they see stuff online or they see a commercial or a video from PETA that calls into question. And so I'm really trying to target that kind of group of people who are looking for information for food. So if they go out there and they're looking for it, I want them to find me. That is not the only people in my audience. My audience includes a lot of farmers and ranchers. That's just the nature of the way it goes. But I don't create content for farmers and ranchers. Anytime I'm going to write a blog post or put a video up or take a photo or just create a message, my thought is, does this fit the audience that I'm trying to reach? And if the answer to that is no, then I don't post it. I'm not going to waste time on it.
Sure. Yeah. I feel like, our food supply is very safe today, and it's on the global scale, it's affordable in a lot of ways. And I feel like that has allowed for people in that generation specifically, or just in the United States period, to be able to ask those questions and be a bit more curious without being like, oh, this is the cheapest thing I can find. Let me just buy that.
Yeah, that's one of the really great things about American agriculture is that we have such a diverse group of producers and a diverse customer base. There are a wide range of demands and a wide range of options because of those demands. So I think that that's really a defining characteristic of our food supply as producers. We can be really proud of because, I don't know if anybody's walked in a grocery store lately. There are just innumerable choices. Go down the tea aisle or coffee or something like that, or go through the dairy section. There's just so many choices, and I think that we should be really proud of that, and we should be proud of the fact that we give consumers what they want. They might have to pay more for it, but we do give them what they want, and not every country can boast that.
Now that we've kind of defined what your target audience is, how does that influence really the content that you're putting out? You mentioned that if it doesn't meet their needs, you don't really work on that. So what does that mean in the work that you do on a daily basis?
I guess I'll tell you what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that I'm going to put stuff up on my Facebook that would make fun of grocery shoppers or something like that. I feel like there are some agricultural promoters that they see a funny meme that makes fun of a consumer. And while that gets clicks, that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to erode the trust that I have built by offending the people who are trying to find information. So in terms of creating content, that means thinking about, as I'm out on the ranch, not yesterday, but the day before, I was feeding silage. And so I'm thinking about what kind of stuff would the person who's never seen silage, doesn't know what it is, what kind of stuff would they find interesting about that process? So I almost try to step outside of myself and put myself in the shoes of a non-farming person, because so often in farming and ranching, we think that what we're doing is really mundane and boring. But to someone who's never experienced that before, they might think it's really interesting. So I put a video up of the cow that had a C-section, just a short, it's maybe 9 or 10 seconds on my Instagram. And it's at 80,000 views, I think, right now. Clearly, there are people not involved in agriculture who find that interesting, because I don't think 80,000 farmers and ranchers are ooh, a C-section. So it's just really thinking about, if I was not a farmer or rancher, would I find this interesting? And then maybe it's just a video, maybe it's a photo, but then it's also not using industry jargon to explain something, but explaining it in a way that's transparent, but also isn't full of like industry terms.
If you had one piece of advice to give producers that were interested in getting started on social media and they were maybe not working on the same target audience as you, but were formulating their target audience, what might that piece of advice be?
I guess my first piece of advice would be just do it. Like, stop thinking I'm not qualified enough, or what would I say, or no one will listen to me or read my stuff, and just do it. And the second piece, you only ask for one, sorry. After you do that, before you post anything, figure out what your audience is. Because if you don't know your audience, you're going to waste a lot of time and energy figuring it out.
Great advice there for producers looking to get started, and encouragement for those out there that are even just interested. Just start somewhere. It can be something small as just an Instagram page and moving from there.
Absolutely. I mean, how many people don't have a smartphone?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know the facts on that, but I mean, my dad is a 60-something rancher, and he loved his flip phone, but he has an iPhone now. He doesn't take a lot of photos, but he does have an iPhone. And so I think most people have smartphones and can take that phone out and take a picture. Like, when are you in the feed truck and don't have your phone? Like, never. Take photos of you feeding. Take a picture of your bale bed unrolling a round bale of hay. Take pictures in a blizzard of you out taking care of them. Like, literally everything we do is foreign to people who live in the middle of a big city.
Absolutely. And as that audience grows more and more, that audience that's not connected to ag, I feel like people like yourself are becoming more and more significant in the important role that they play in educating consumers. So thanks so much for all that you do, Brandi.
Well, I appreciate that. Selfishly, I'm got involved in being an advocate because I want to preserve like this livelihood in this ranch, not only for my husband and I, because we're pouring our time and our sweat and tears and blood and money into it. I want it to be around for my daughters, and if they decide to have kids, I want it to be around for their kids. Like, selfishly, I want to preserve it for my family for generations. And then on a more broad scope, I want American agriculture to continue to thrive. I want people to see agriculture in America and know where their food comes from. So there's kind of two drivers behind it. And so it's for my family, but then also for the larger community as well.
Absolutely. And if people are tuning in or watching and they haven't seen your stuff on Instagram or other social media formats, which I doubt there's very many people out there that have it, but if they're interested in seeing more of what you do, Brandi, where can they find you at?
My Facebook page is Buzzard's Beat. It's Buzzard like the bird, 'S, Beat. On Instagram, I am Brandi Buzzard. And then the blog is Buzzard's Beat, so www.buzzardsbeat.com. And then in March, actually in a couple weeks, I'm launching a streaming channel on Acres TV, and people can find me there. It's Buzzard's Beat with Brandi Buzzard, and that is ranch life, rodeo, trail stuff, and then also commentary on issues in the beef industry and in agriculture. So the first episode, I'm just going to give a teaser. It's talking about consumer and activist expectations when it comes to greenhouse gases. So head on over to acrestv.com. Maybe people will check that out.
Wonderful. Well, Brandi, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. I really appreciate your time and for sharing all of your insight with us and listeners that are tuning in.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was really great to be here, and I hope that people will be inspired to use their voice and stand up for the industry they love.
Once again, everyone, that was K-State alum Brandi Buzzard joining us for a conversation on knowing your audience on social media. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We're ending this Monday's show as we always do with this week's wildlife segment. And joining us for that this week is K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Specialist Joe Gerken. So, Joe, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. So this week you wanted to talk about this really cool program in Kansas. It's a walk-in fishing access program. So tell us a bit about it.
Yeah, so WIFA, walk-in fishing access. A lot of people say walk-in fishing areas, but they're just private ponds. The state has a lease with the landowners, and it provides access to some private bodies of water for the public to go fish in. Similar a lot to the WIHA, walk-in hunting areas that people are maybe more familiar with. So I wanted to chat about the fishing opportunities that these bring to us in Kansas.
So let's start with the aspect from a landowner's perspective. What kind of benefit does this sort of program have for them?
Sure. So the program started in 1998, and since then the state's really worked to make it beneficial for the landowners themselves. The state might come in and help with stocking fish. They might come in and help with habitat. One of the big things that it does for landowners is help to control access. So these walk-in fishing areas are open from sunrise to a half hour after sunset for the most part. So kind of knowing people are coming and going, they have access to that land, but only certain periods of time is a big benefit. to the landowners. So there's also a cash payment that varies based on proximity in the state and size of your pond, but it's somewhere around $100 per acre per year that you're getting as the landowner for access to your pond. So quite a few benefits for the landowners to participate in the program.
And when it comes to people that maybe utilize this program, the actual fishers that are going out and taking advantage of this opportunity, what do those people need to know about it?
First thing is that private landowners are inviting us onto their land, right? So make sure you're always respectful. That's a good rule of thumb all the time, but especially when we have private landowners that are opening up their ponds. So be respectful. Make sure you don't leave litter or vandalize anything. Be really aware of where you're parking your vehicles so that you're not blocking access to get to their fields or something like that. You're not blocking that at all. So provide access, be respectful. There also are some fishing regulations that we need to consider. Most of the walk-in fishing areas allow for 2 channel catfish to be kept and 2 largemouth bass. Most of those have to be over 18 inches in size. But just make sure you check those regulations and you're following the law while you're on the property. And most of all, be respectful while you're there. That's really important.
Yeah, that rule of leave somewhere better than you found it, right?
That's right.
When it comes to kind of those regulations with what you're catching, does that apply to like catch and release situations if someone's bringing a kid and they just want the fun experience?
Sure. So catch and release is definitely allowed and encouraged. Again, with those opportunities for kids, that's really great. Bluegill, green sunfish, some of those smaller fish for kids, catch and release. So I just wanted to point out that there are some regulations if you do decide to harvest them.
Yeah, key to know for sure. And then I guess something else that comes into mind when you think of laws surrounding fishing in Kansas might be those fishing licenses, right? Do those still apply here?
Fishing licenses, we could dive deep into that topic, but walk-in fishing areas, once they're leased by the state, they're considered public waterways for the purpose of licenses. So unless you're the landowner or the immediate family, you do need a fishing license. That's important to remember. And fishing licenses, we view those sometimes as an expense, but they help to fund different opportunities, such as this walk-in fishing access. Those monies go back to the state, and they really help to provide a lot of fishing opportunities and conservation opportunities. So we view it as an expense. I think maybe we should view a fishing license or a hunting license more as an investment. So we're giving back to that conservation and providing more of these opportunities moving forward.
Absolutely. So, Joe, if listeners are tuning in and they want to take advantage of this either as a landowner or as someone that's doing the fishing themselves, where can they learn more about it or maybe even sign up for these programs?
Sure. So Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks is who oversees the program. So definitely go to their website, check them out. There's even a link on there for how to reach the people in charge of the walk-in fishing access program. So you can send them an email directly saying that, hey, I'm interested in participating in this. KDWP also puts out a fishing atlas that shows where all of these locations are. So you can check and make sure that they are actually involved in the program. One last quick thing to mention, all of these walk-in fishing areas should be marked clearly with a sign that says they're participating in that program. So make sure you see that sign, and if you don't see that sign, assume that it is not enrolled in that program anymore. We don't want to be accessing that land without permission.
Good reminder for sure, and some great insight on such a fun program for Kansas. So thanks so much, Joe, for joining us.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Specialist Joe Gerken rounding out today's show with our wildlife segment. We'll be back with more tomorrow on Agriculture Today.